Okay, now we're moving on to the functions of Parliament. And there are 4 key functions. And in this video, we're going to look at the first one, which is to legislate, to introduce, debate and pass law. The majority of laws, particularly the ones that you and I will be most familiar with, are referred to as public bills. Those are those government-backed pieces of legislation, more often than not, promised in an election manifesto. There's another type of bill, private members' bills. They're less likely to be successful. We're going to talk about those later on. But 13 Fridays per parliamentary session are dedicated to private members' bills. There were 324 tabled in the years 2015 to 2017. Only 14 of them were successful. So whereas public bills are overwhelmingly successful when the government has a majority, private members' bills less so. So for any public bill in Parliament to be passed, 3 things need to happen. The bill must pass through both the Commons and the Lords. Quite often, legislation begins in the Commons and then moves to the Lords, but there are some examples of bills starting in the Lords, making their way to the Commons. It must pass through both houses. It must pass the test of scrutiny and debate in both chambers of Parliament. They can be amended, but those amendments must be agreed upon and voted on. And finally, for a bill to become a law, for a proposal to become legally practicable, we need royal assent. We need the signature of Queen Elizabeth II to turn a bill into a law. And remember, I said in previous videos, it's been over 300 years since that wasn't given. So royal assent is very much a formality in that process. And you might be surprised at the lack of public bills that are actually passed per parliamentary session. We're looking at about 30 to 40 public bills passed every year. In 2020, just 29 public bills were passed. So you might be surprised at the lack of action in terms of legislation. Every law begins life as a green paper, a discussion document. It sets out the issues and options for new legislation. And you can see there, I've just picked an example from 2015, teaching excellence, social mobility and student choice. So a green paper sets out what is to be discussed, what are the issues facing the matter under debate, and what are the possible options for new legislation. A green paper then becomes a white paper, which is a detailed plan and proposal for the legislation. So as a green paper is more of a discussion document of what may happen, a white paper is a proposal. The vast majority of laws are not a surprise to the electorate or to other MPs themselves. Every party has a manifesto at election time in which they make pledges, and the victorious party has a mandate, a responsibility to introduce that legislation that was promised in the election. And also every year at the opening of Parliament, the Queen gives the Queen's speech written by the government where it lays out its legislative programme for the year. So there shouldn't really be very many surprises to parliamentarians or to the electorate when these white papers make their way to be debated. We're going to go to the next slide now, and I will tell you about the process of a bill becoming a law. Okay, so you can see there that there are essentially seven stages with some exceptions, which we'll talk about in a moment. The first reading, we'll consider a bill that begins in the House of Commons because the vast majority of bills do. The first reading of legislation of a bill is when the relevant government minister announces the title of the bill. There is no debate at the first reading stage. It is essentially warning parliamentarians, informing parliamentarians that this bill will appear before the House. In the second reading, we get our first debate of the bill on the Commons floor. And quite often, Even when there are reservations about legislation, the bill makes it through this stage. The last time a government was defeated with a bill at this stage was 1986. Then it makes its way to the committee stage. And that is when public bill committees consider the legislation line by line, suggest amendments, they call expert witnesses to add their opinion. The government has a majority on these committees, and therefore it's rare that we get major changes to the legislation. And the committee itself lasts for the lifetime of the bill. So when the bill is passed into law, the committee no longer sits. But this is an opportunity to make sure that the legislation is appropriate. Because there is a government majority, quite often the scrutiny of the legislation itself is limited. This is more an opportunity to look for any potential loopholes, any potential issues, suggest amendments and get some feedback from experts in that area. Then we get to the report stage. And this is when amendments from the committee stage are considered in the Commons. They can be accepted, rejected, or changed even further. Then we get to the third reading, which is the final opportunity for debate on the amended version. No further changes are permitted after the report stage. So the third reading is you accept or reject the bill as it is. And when you vote as an MP, are you going to give your consent to this becoming law or not? Then it moves into the House of Lords, where the same process happens again. If there are any amendments presented during the Lords stages, then it needs to go back to the Commons to be accepted. The Commons can then send that back. The Lords can send it back. And we get into a situation known as parliamentary ping-pong, when legislation, quite often the wording of it or an amendment, a particular aspect of a bill, can be debated back and forth between the two chambers, and we call that parliamentary ping-pong. Now, there is a way for the House of Commons to end that ping-pong, and that is by invoking the Parliament Act, and that means that their version of a bill becomes the law within a year of that final version being agreed. Now that happens very rarely. It's quite rare that the Commons and the Lords can be so divided on an issue. The last time this happened was 2004 and the Hunting Act, whereby the government, the Labour government of the time, wanted to introduce strict restrictions on fox hunting, and that faced some opposition in the House of Lords, where some of those members moved in social circles where fox hunting was something you did in your leisure time. And the Hunting Act, the Commons version, eventually became law in 2004 when the two chambers couldn't come to an agreement on the legislation. Now, there's one type of law that has a slightly different process, and that is English votes for English laws. Scottish, Northern Irish and Welsh only issues can be dealt with in the respective devolved assemblies. But Westminster isn't a parliament for England, it's a parliament for the United Kingdom. So when English only issues arise, there is a separate legislative process, and I'll tell you about it on the next slide. Okay. So, in the absence of an English assembly, there is a process within the Westminster Parliament for issues that only affect constituents in England. So, English MPs can essentially veto all of or parts of a bill that applies only to constituents living in England. Now, it is up to the Speaker to decide whether or not a bill or clauses of a bill are valid for the English votes for English Lords process. As you can see, it is after the reporting stage, which is the fourth sort of step of legislation, that EVEL essentially kicks in, because the Speaker receives the bill and decides whether or not it is relevant. If it is relevant, it gets sent to the Legislative Grand Committee. And the Legislative Grand Committee is essentially an opportunity for all MPs to debate and take part, but only English MPs in the debate can vote on or promote amendments to that process. So there is an additional legislative process for English MPs voting on matters that only affect English constituents. That doesn't have to be an entire bill. It may be an aspect of a bill, but if it only affects the people of England, there is that extra layer of legislation. You can see that if consent is withheld, it is reconsidered. If consent is ultimately withheld, then the clauses of the bill or the whole bill itself are defeated. If it is successful and it is eventually agreed, then it goes to the third reading stage. So that extra layer of legislative process is there to ensure that English MPs have a direct say on English-only matters. They are either successful, sometimes part of a bill can go through while another part, certain clauses are taken out, and in some occasions, rarely, the whole bill can be defeated. A law, or a bill that affects England only must therefore be approved by a majority of all MPs and all English MPs. And that's something that we refer to as the double veto. There are two opportunities for this legislation to be scrutinised and changed and amended and defeated. And so that legislation goes through a more strenuous legislative process than everything else. The majority of legislation in the House of Commons is secondary legislation, otherwise known as statutory instruments. And that is when there is a provision within existing legislation to include changes or new clauses. So, for example, the Misuse of Drugs Act was passed in 1971, but new substances can be added to that list over time. Now, secondary legislation is minister-made law. It is not passed by Parliament. So in the early 2010s, we had the issue of so-called legal highs, things like synthetic cannabinoids. And what would happen is that these pseudo-chemists, these businesses, would create chemicals that were somewhat similar to a banned substance, that would have a similar effect on the person ingesting the substance, quite often more or less harmful. But what it was a way for people to legally create psychoactive substances without breaking the law. And so what eventually happened is all so-called legal highs were criminalised after legislation was amended. And so this Misuse of Drugs Act passed first of all in the 1970s. A government minister, the relevant government minister, can add to that list of banned substances over time. Parliament doesn't vote on whether or not a new substance would be added to the list. A minister simply does that themselves. And there is so much more secondary legislation or statutory instruments than primary. So we said before we're looking at between 30 and 40 public bills becoming law every year. Annually, we're looking at between 3,000 and 4,000 SIs passed every year. They are scrutinised by a committee, the Joint Committee on Statutory Instruments, and that is made up of a mixture of MPs and peers. And so we've got an idea of the opinion of both the Commons and the Lords on the issue. And crucially, in this committee, it's a rare example where the government doesn't enjoy a majority. So it provides an effective check on what the government is trying to do. The job of the committee is to ensure that what is happening to the primary legislation is legal and doesn't go beyond the original provisions of the bill. And so secondary legislation is seen to add to or strengthen existing legislation, not to beef up its powers, so to speak. And finally, we have private members' bills. When we get to liberalism, we will look at John Stuart Mill, who, as an MP, famously introduced a private members' bill trying to grant suffrage to women in the United Kingdom way back in the 19th century, many years, in fact, before Parliament actually passed that law. Private members' bills are an example of MPs having an individual influence on legislation. However, their success rate is much lower than a public bill. If you can imagine, a public bill has been most likely been in the government's manifesto and therefore has been promised to the people of the country. The government has a mandate to introduce it, more often than not has a majority in the House of Commons with which they can whip MPs to vote in favour of it. So public bills are overwhelmingly successful. Private members' bills tend to struggle. There are some famous examples of laws that began their life as a private members' bill. The Abortion Act of 1967, for example, began life as a private members' bill in the House of Commons. Now, there are three different types of private members' bill: ballot bills, 10-minute rule bills, and finally, presentation bills. We'll talk about all three of those now. Okay, ballot bills. As I said at the beginning, way back at the start of this video, I said that there were 13 Fridays set aside for consideration of private members' bills. The first 7 of those 13 Fridays are for this type of PMB, a ballot bill. And it's the most likely type of a private members' bill to eventually be successful. MPs can enter a ballot and then 20 names are drawn out of a hat, and those 20 become the 20 MPs able to present a ballot bill to the Commons. It is at this point that pressure groups can have influence, or if you're an MP for a governing party, sometimes you get so-called handout bills. If the government has legislation that it wants to introduce, but it wasn't in the manifesto, sometimes they can give an MP a so-called handout bill, and they can give their support to the bill. And therefore, a so-called handout is the most likely way of a private members' bill getting passed. Not because it has the support of the government, but essentially it was the idea of the government in the first place, and all you are is a sponsor for that legislation. One issue that ballot bills have is that only a certain amount of time is set out for them, those 13 Fridays. And so each bill is allocated a limited amount of time, and therefore they can be talked to death. For example, in 2016, there was a so-called Turing bill, which would have pardoned men who were convicted of same-sex crimes prior to the decriminalisation of male homosexuality. A government minister spoke for 25 minutes on the issue, which meant that there was no time at the end of the discussion for a vote to take place. Conservative MP Christopher Chope of Christchurch essentially killed a private members' bill in 2018, which would have made upskirting a criminal offence. He was much criticised for his decision, and his defence of his actions was not that he was in favour of upskirting, but he didn't believe that legislation should come from one MP. He believed that only government-backed legislation should be considered. He has an issue with private members' bills. So he killed this private members' bill in 2018. It led to uproar at the time because there seemed to be a desire amongst politicians and the public for a move to make upskirting illegal. What it led to the government actually bringing in its own public bill, which was eventually successful. In 2022, Bolton South East MP Yasmin Qureshi was selected as 9th on the ballot. And as a Labour MP in a Conservative government, it is tougher to get and whip up a majority of support for your private members bill to be successful. There were some examples of successful private members bills, the ballot bills in 2022, and one of them was Liam Fox with his Down Syndrome Act, passed in 2022 with support of the government and therefore a majority of MPs in the House of Commons. Okay, the second type of private members bill is the so-called 10-minute rule bill. After questions in the Commons on a Tuesday and Wednesday, there is a 10-minute speaking slot opened up. This is usually a way for a backbencher to raise constituency concerns. Now, the whips decide who speaks in these slots. So it undermines the independence of an MP in the process, particularly when they're trying to get this bill onto the Commons floor. They are rarely successful, but there is one example. In 2017, the Guardianship Missing Persons Act was passed, and that was essentially to allow guardians to act on behalf of a missing person if they have been missing for, I believe, 90 days. That was originally a 10-minute rule bill introduced by Conservative MP Kevin Hollinrake, who represents Thirsk and Malton. So it is rare to see a 10-minute rule bill achieve success, but examples are there if we look hard enough for them. And finally, the least likely type of private members bill to succeed is a presentation bill. Any MP can introduce a presentation bill after giving notice to the Public Bill Office. They are presented on a Friday after the ballot bills on the order paper for the day have been heard. So on those 13 Fridays for consideration of private members bills, once the order of the day has sort of been achieved, you then have the opportunity to present a presentation bill. There is no speech on the bill and there is no debate, and for that reason MPs are unwilling to give their consent to a bill that hasn't been sold to them and certainly hasn't been debated in terms of its pros and cons. For a presentation bill to be successful, it needs to be plain, simple and uncontroversial. But it is very rare that a presentation bill is in fact successful. The easiest way for an individual MP to get a change in the law is quite often not through a private members bill, but to lobby for changes to legislation before it's even debated. This is, of course, reserved only for MPs belonging to the governing party on close votes. If a government cannot be sure of a clear, strong majority vote on the issue, a wavering MP might be brought on side by being able to influence changes and amendments to the legislation. In the time of Tony Blair in 2007, pressure from backbench MPs persuaded the government to construct the Corporate Manslaughter Act. So there are opportunities for backbench MPs, both individually and collectively as a group, to pressure the government to introduce a public bill. And because public bills are so much more successful than private members' bills, that is quite often a more effective way of having an influence. Okay, so a quick recap of legislation in Parliament. Most bills that you and I will have heard of are public bills, government-backed quite often in the manifesto prior to the last general election. But the other type of bill that I've spoken to you about is private members' bills as well. Remember that public bills, there are far fewer of them, but they are far more likely to succeed. For a bill to become law, it must pass through the Commons and the Lords. It must be scrutinised and debated in the Commons and the Lords. It can be amended. And of course, that signature from the Queen, the monarch, must grant royal assent for a bill to become law. That is a convention that the monarch does that as an apolitical part of the British Constitution. The monarch has granted royal assent in the last 300 years to every bill that has passed the Commons and the Lords. There are far fewer public bills than secondary legislation. Public bills about 30 to 40 passed a year. There are between 3,000 and 4,000 secondary legislation, otherwise known as statutory instruments, passed every year in Parliament. Every bill begins life as a green paper, a discussion document. After that discussion has taken place and the issues and the options are discussed, it becomes a white paper, and then it is ready for the legislative process. We have the first reading, where the bill's title is read out to Parliament and no debate takes place at that stage. Then we get the second reading, a debate on the Commons floor, and again, we've said that the last government defeat at this stage, the second reading, was 1986. So it's very rare for a bill not to make it through that second stage. Then it gets to the committee, where public bill committees consider the bill, they bring experts in, they look at any potential issues with the legislation as it stands, and they recommend amendments. Then it gets to the report stage, where any changes and amendments from the committee stage are then considered on the floor of the Commons. They can be accepted, rejected, or changed at that point. After the report stage, we get the third reading, the final debate on the amended version of the bill. And remember that no changes can be made to a bill at this stage. Once it goes through the report stage, the third reading is voting and giving your consent to the bill as it is written, with no prospect for future amendment to it. It then goes to the House of Lords, where the process is repeated. And remember that we can get into a situation where a bill is ping-ponged from the Lords to the Commons when an amendment is suggested in one chamber of Parliament but then changed by the other. Remember that parliamentary ping-pong, although it quite often solves itself, the Commons can invoke the Parliament Act, which means that their version can become law within 12 months of the Commons coming to an agreement on it. And that is an example of the Commons having superiority over the Lords. Remember, though, that in all of that process, we do have English votes for English laws, which is a separate process for legislation affecting only the constituents of England. And essentially, laws like that, or clauses, parts of bills that only affect the English members of the United Kingdom, they essentially go through a double veto, because a majority of all MPs and a majority of English MPs have to give their consent to that legislation. I then talked about secondary legislation, which is when a minister updates an existing law. As I said, we had over 3,500 of those or so every year passed. Secondary legislation or statutory instruments are minister-made law. They are not debated and voted on by Parliament, but they are scrutinised by the Joint Committee on Statutory Instruments, made up of a mixture of MPs and members of the House of Lords, and the government does not have a majority on that committee. So it is the opportunity for the committee to ensure that the change to the existing legislation is legal and doesn't go beyond the powers of the law that was first signed. Parliament can approve and deny statutory instruments, but it cannot amend them, so therefore they are less scrutinised than public bills. Finally, I talked to you about 3 types of private members' bills. First of all, ballot bills. 7 of the 13 Fridays set aside for discussion of private members' bills are for ballot bills. 20 MPs' names are picked out of a hat, and these ballot bills can be discussed. Quite often we see that MPs from the governing party are more likely to be successful. And remember that these ballot bills can be talked to death, because there's only a certain amount of time for these bills to be discussed. And if time runs out on the debate, it does not become law. The second type of private members' bill is the 10-minute rule bill, a speaking slot after questions for government ministers on a Tuesday and a Wednesday. The party whips decide these slots and who gets to speak in them, and that undermines the independence of MPs in the process, because remember, the whips are in charge of getting the government's legislation and the government's priorities through Parliament, and the whips can essentially knock down or ignore private members' bills in this form if they don't like the sound of them, and it is rare that they are successful. Finally, the least successful type of private members' bill is a presentation bill. Any MP can introduce a presentation bill after letting the Public Bill Office know that they wish to do so. They present them on a Friday after the order of the day, so after all the ballot bills have been heard. No speech is given on behalf of the bill, no debate is held, and so therefore it is very unlikely to pass and get the support of a majority of MPs when simply one MP has written a bill that they intend to become law. So it's very rare that a presentation bill is successful. If it was to be unsuccessful, it needs to be minor, simple and uncontroversial, and it's very rare in politics to find a matter that has not been dealt with that is all three of those things. As I said with these videos in previous versions of them, listen, make notes if you wish, but please go back to this, particularly for revision. How you make notes and how you prepare for exams and tests that come up is essentially up to you at this level in the sixth form. If you learn well from listening to these videos, fantastic. You could even have a go at making some of your own too. But what you do with this is essentially up to you.